Hosea 11 through 14. Well, as we close up the book of Hosea, again, a good book for rehearsing the entire story of the Old Testament, we come upon in chapter 12 a rehearsal of a story that happened way back in Genesis 32. In fact, I'd recommend going back and watching the video on Genesis 30 to 32 to set up this question here, because this is a retelling, really, of that story. And I would even call it a clarification of what actually happened that day. Back in Genesis 32, we heard that, in fact, here is the story. Genesis 32 from verses 24 to 30. I'll just summarize it, that Jacob is left alone and he wrestles with a man. The Hebrew word is just the general term for man. Until the break of the day, and this man realizes he cannot win in this fight, and he hits Jacob in his hip, puts it out of joint, and then Jacob says the important phrase, "Bless me," to this being. Now again, we had made this comment back in Genesis 30 that the idea of a human asking blessing is very common when it comes to divine beings, that this is the role of a divine being, is to bless a human. And the fact that we hear him, Jacob, call this place Peniel at the end of the story, the face of a divine being, shows that yes, Jacob knew by the time the story was over, or ending at least, that as he fought with this man, that he was not just a man, but he was actually a divine being. Now at the end of the story, importantly again, it says that this being blessed Jacob. And so as we close the story of Genesis 32, we have Jacob wrestling with a man, and now the question comes, and most Christian sermons or teachings about this have wondered how to apply the story, and here's how it's usually done, is that God, because in the Genesis 32 story, most Christian Bibles, in fact every one you can read, has the idea that God fought with Jacob, that Yahweh in some sense came down into the form of a man, and Yahweh struggled with Jacob, and it's usually preached in terms of like struggling in prayer or something like that. But listen to how Hosea, now that we're reading Hosea chapter 12 verses 3 through 7, define this story. And I'm using the Jewish Publication Society because again it's careful use of the Hebrew language. Here's Hosea 12 verse 3. The Lord once indicted Judah and punished Jacob for his conduct, requited him for his deeds. And then he gives two examples of what he did in wrongdoing. In the womb, he tried to supplant his brother. Remember how Jacob grabbed the heel of Esau. Secondly, grown to manhood, he strove with a divine being. He strove with an angel, the word malach or messenger, and prevailed. The other, speaking of this person, had to weep and implore him. At Bethel, Jacob would meet him there to commune with him. But notice again how that is placed in a sense of indictment, or God saying this should not have happened. Why? Because remember what happens in the story. He asks for blessing from a divine being other than Yahweh, and in fact he was blessed by a divine being. So the verses end then in Hosea 11 or Hosea 12 with this phrase, "Yet the Lord, Yahweh, the God of hosts, must be invoked as Lord. You must return to your God. Practice goodness and justice and constantly trust in your God." The point is this, that in Hosea 12 we go back and we replay the story of Genesis 32, realizing it was not God that struggled with Jacob that day, but it was a divine being. In other words, the Hebrew language using El, we've learned, does not necessarily have a capital G attached to it. So the story, according to Hosea 12, is that a divine being came down and, through a human, literally fought Jacob to his hurt, or to the intent of injuring him, possibly knowing that he was God's man for the day and God's representative. So in that fight, and in that odd moment where Jacob was able to hold his own, but then ask for blessing and be blessed, here is where Hosea comes now, some hundreds of hundreds of years later. And through God, Hosea is able to say, we made a mistake through our father Jacob that day. We did in Jacob what we have been doing now since that time, into leading into captivity, that we have been asking for blessing from the wrong beings. So why is this story important? Remember how it ends by this being giving Jacob a new name, Israel. And there is divine being, and Isra seems to be the idea of rule. So the idea of your God rules seems to be the point of that story, which is fascinating in the sense that a divine being admits who's in charge. Your God rules over me. And I think that's a good way to see how that story, in a reverse sort of way, tells the story of the Bible. What I find interesting is that in Acts 11, we have the rare use of the term Christian. Now think of two terms, or can we think of two terms that are more apropos or more proudly held on to today than Israel and Christian? Of course, Old Testament and New. This title, I'd recommend, was given to us, or given to Israel, Jacob, by his enemy. In other words, it was a title admitted to by this divine being. Remember how in Acts 11 the word Christian was given to Christians not by the friends of the Christians, but by its enemies, and by Antioch Gentiles, who used this term in derision, that they were little Christs. They were following a man who had been killed, who had been martyred. And so it's interesting to me, I believe, based on Hosea 12, that both of the greatest titles that we have in the Christian and Jewish tradition were given to us by our enemies.